Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending today's webinar session. Obviously, quite short notice for many of you. You would have received the invitation earlier this week. And this is one of the very responsive themes that we're trying to tackle, given the civil unrest that we've experienced over the last short while. So firstly, just wanting to reach out to all the firms and just express our condolences to those of you that may have lost buildings or suffered any sort of damage to your businesses and to your families. For those of you that have suffered any sort of severe trauma, we really our thoughts are with you, and we're glad that you could make some time to be with us here today. As it's quite a lot of frustration that's been going around, especially in light of the crisis, and then this weird juxtaposition of this week where things almost seem to be back to normal again after a week that felt somewhat apocalyptic. It's really important that we try to tackle this topic now while it's still relevant and front of mind for many of us. So we just want to acknowledge what's been experienced by the firms, but also we know that as South African people, we are extremely resilient. And the furniture sector has taken many knocks in the past. For some of us, we can be feeling a bit downcast and demotivated. So, just in some of the discussions I've had this week, there's hope for growth, not just recovery, but for growth. And we know that if we can get market-led growth, then we can get manufacturing growth in the local sector. So it makes it super important to understand the impact that this unrest has had, not only on demand, but then also supply being super important. So with that being said, we are really excited today to be joined by a fantastic panel of retail and manufacturing representatives. And I'll introduce them shortly. But yeah, we just wanted to issue a warm welcome to everyone today. Before we continue, just obviously this wouldn't be made possible without the funding of eThekwini Municipality. And we'd also like to acknowledge SAFI for partnering with us for today's webinar. And then just in terms of the competition law, in no ways do we feel or is this session considered anti-competitive at all? And so there will be no discussions in terms of price collusion, tendering, etc. in today's session. Right, so you may have received a communication from us either late yesterday or early this morning, which was just updated with the panelist information, but also you will have noted that there is a link to a survey that has been shared. The eThekwini Furniture Cluster, as part of B&M Analysts, has received a direct request from the Presidency of South Africa to provide information in terms of the impact on manufacturing and more specifically furniture manufacturing in South Africa. So please use this opportunity to provide information that will influence the Presidency's sectoral relief and support. And we need the survey responses by the end of today. So if you could take 5 minutes, you're even welcome to complete the survey during this webinar session. Please do so. It will have massive influence on the sector, but also it's your opportunity to have a direct line to the Presidency as well. My colleague Marco has posted the link in the chat, so you can access the jot form there. In terms of what we're trying to achieve in today's session, firstly, we want to just be able to assess the extent of the damages across the furniture value chain, identify where the critical damage is and what is needed to fix it quickly to get production back on track, to understand the likely impact on demand and supply in the short to medium term, and then understanding the likely medium and longer term challenges. Again, all this information is super influential in terms of policy, in terms of customer decisions, in terms of manufacturing decisions. So I would really encourage everyone that is attending the session to please engage as best as possible. There is a Q&A function where you can ask any questions to the panel. I will be keeping an eye on it throughout the session. And there's also a chat function that you're welcome to use to engage around the topic as well. So maybe in terms of trying to get a little bit of an icebreaker out, I could ask all the attendees on the session just to type in the chat function who you are, the name of your firm, and where you are calling us from. It would be great to hear from you and to know who's in the room. Cool, let's see, we're getting some messages coming through. We've got Aubrey Henning. Thank you, Aubrey, for getting the things going. Madeline from PG Bice in Cape Town. Ian from the Midlands. Quite a few PG Bison individuals. Jody from Trendy Holding, nice to have you here. Restonics PE, sure, okay, Eastern Cape. More Restonics, Cape Town again. Awesome, it's so great to see all of you. Oh, Aubrey, you're from Joburg, that's awesome. Hopefully you weren't hit too badly in Gauteng. Some more from Trendy Holding, Durban, to Fadzwa from DTech, nice to have you here. Durban, Joburg, this is great. Thanks everyone. Please continue to use the chat function. It's really awesome to see that we can have such a diverse mix of individuals in the group. Great, so I'm sure many of you have received this image on WhatsApp. But just to, if you haven't heard it already, just to emphasize that the impact of this crisis has been significant. Not necessarily just on livelihoods, which we know is going to have a massive impact, but we've seen a lot of retail stores being hit. Some of the worst hits include PEP, Mr. Price, TFG at Home, or TFG more broadly as a group, the Spar Group, all the way through to Cashbuild, Edgar's, famous brands as well. So quite significant customer repercussions, and then also influence on the informal, formal traders, over 40,000 businesses affected. These stats are scary and ones that we were able to get, but I think this discussion is really important to really assess the impact and come up with solutions going forward. Alrighty, so without further ado, I would really like to, and I'm privileged to introduce our panel to you today. We have Lucy Mullins, who's Head of Sourcing at Mr. Price Home. Lisa Barnard, who's the Furniture Buying Manager of At Home. We've got Mohammed Hansa, who's Head of Group Support Services at Fair Price. And he may be joined today with the CEO of Fair Price as well. And of course, we've got Bernadette Isaacs, who's the Managing Director of Safi. So we'd just like to extend a really warm welcome and thanks to the panel. And thank you so much to everyone for assisting with today's session. So before we get started, just a friendly reminder to everyone that if you do have any questions for the panel whilst we are having a discussion, to please use the Q&A function, and you're more than welcome to chat amongst yourselves using the chat. And there will be 1 or 2 polls that come up during today's session as well. Great, so let's get the show on the road. Let's kick this off by, let's just take stock. Where are we? What's happening at the moment? And maybe I can just ask Bernadette just to give us an overview of what we've been seeing this last week in terms of how this crisis has affected KZN and even South African-based manufacturers.
Hi, good afternoon, Paige, and thank you once again for inviting Safi, and good afternoon to all the attendees in the session today. So as you've mentioned, Paige, yes, the last 2 weeks have been quite devastating on the furniture industry. We've engaged with various associations, engaged with government organizations, also just so that we could understand the impact that this has had on the furniture manufacturing sector. And particularly in the KZN region, and then of late in the Gauteng region. But just that our KZN region is our second biggest manufacturing region in the country. And that, yeah, very disturbed to hear that one of our biggest manufacturers in that region was looted. And yeah, so that has had a major impact because they employ a majority of our manufacturers in that, majority of our employees in that area. So yes, and sort of the consequences that will have on the broader value chain. So yes, it has been quite devastating to see the amount of damage and the impact that will possibly have on employment and employees going forward.
Thanks, Bernadette. Mohammed, maybe you can chat to what you've been seeing in terms of your manufacturers in KZN and in the Gauteng area.
Thank you, Paige. Good afternoon, everyone. From what we've seen, a lot of our manufacturers come from the very smaller type manufacturers, using an area in Joburg, which is called Mansfield. It's an industrial hub for furniture manufacturing, especially smaller manufacturers. The area was devastated a couple of years ago through looting and civil unrest. And this a week and a half ago's incidents just took a toll on that industry. The smaller manufacturers are now, battling. A lot of the business owners have become security guards. It puts pressure on supply chains. That's from a pure manufacturer's hat, from a supply chain. From a retailer's hat, I mean, the impact is going to be huge because some of the retail bases that are supporting these manufacturers have been decimated. From the stats there, and you can work it out, anything between 5 and 20% of retailers' businesses have been affected. And what this does downstream is decimates the manufacturer. And upstream, whatever business support services that you offer to your clients in terms of in our business, we've empowered a group of delivery guys. These people have less work to do because of servicing a smaller area. That's number one. Number two is a lot of these businesses have been damaged in terms of like some of the drivers that work within our network. They lost vehicles trying to become security guards. So their vehicles actually got burned in an attempt to save whatever their business interests were, and not necessarily their own stores, but their major customers. So yeah, this events had a major impact right across the board.
Yeah, sure. And you raise a very valid point that it's not just the manufacturers, but it's also the business support services that are going to be affected by the situation. Lucy, as a retailer based in KZN with a significant number of suppliers, what has been the feedback you've received from your supply chain?
Thanks, Paige, and hello, everybody. Yeah, we've been contacting our entire supply base over the last few days, or over the last week since the unrest started. And obviously, I'm speaking for our entire local supply base and warehousing solution, not just the furniture industry. And we have had an effect on a certain number of our suppliers. About 8 of our suppliers have been severely affected. Luckily, to date, we haven't had anything back to the point that it's literally been burnt to the ground, although people are obviously experiencing major issues, especially with their IT infrastructure, which is, although you can replace that, you can go out and buy a new laptop, it's very costly. So people are struggling to get back up and running. About 3 of those suppliers are directly related to our furniture area. And they do seem to be getting back on their feet with a resilience that is just remarkable, to be honest with you. But, the guys who were affected, and then there were the guys who weren't affected, which thank goodness is the very vast majority of our supply base and the vast majority of our furniture manufacturers. But it wasn't through chance. They survived because they either spent an absolute fortune on security, or as Mohammed alluded to, they were out there themselves protecting their own businesses with their staff. So it wasn't a case of luck that these people have survived. It was, through really putting their lives on the line. And then obviously for those suppliers that did get overwhelmed, despite having tried so hard, it's absolutely tragic. But in terms of, has it had a huge effect with our particular supply chain? In terms of our first tier suppliers, I don't want to say the word pleasantly surprised, but I'm pleased that it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be when this thing started. Having said that, with people on the line, I'm sure who have been devastated for them as personal and individual business owners, it is absolutely devastating for those individuals.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. And it's really encouraging to know that retail is reaching out to their supply base, not only, to find out the damage, but to offer support. I know Lisa at home's been doing something similar.
Hi, everybody. Yes, I think the most important thing for us was to reach out to our suppliers that was in the area to firstly make sure that they and their staff were okay, and also to offer supports. Luckily, or fortunately, none of our suppliers were directly impacted. One of our raw material suppliers got looted. Yeah, it has been quite devastating to see, but we're just glad that none of our suppliers was directly affected.
Thanks, Lisa. And yeah, it just goes to show that the juxtaposition of MRP versus TFG, and being based in two different provinces, they still get impacted by this crisis. So I'd now just like to offer the opportunity to the attendees of today's session just to give us some feedback as to how have you been affected in terms of your operations by this crisis. A poll should be appearing on your screen now. Great, thanks to everyone that's starting to respond to the poll. Getting some great responses coming through. We'll just give it another minute, and you can respond just by clicking on the options. So if your factory is not or currently fully operational, what are the reasons? And the options there are: you've had damage to your buildings, you've had supply chain disruptions, absenteeism, fear of continued unrest, theft of stock, damage or theft of machinery, and you can select multiple options as well. Great, thanks to everyone who's responded. I'm just going to display the results here. So the biggest impact we seem to be having on the sector is supply chain disruptions, followed by a significant number of firms are fully operational. So that's really positive to see, and actually it's really good to know what impact is being had. Slightly discouraging to see that orders have been withdrawn from a few manufacturers. One has experienced theft of stock, and we are seeing some impact on the workforce through fear and continued unrest and absenteeism. So yeah, thanks so much everyone for responding. That gives us a really positive, or not positive, but strong sense of the sentiment within the sector regarding operations. I'm going to move on to supply chain, and specifically in terms of raw material supply. So Mohammed, maybe I can start with you. Have raw material suppliers been negatively impacted? And what do you think this could mean for the sector in the medium to long term? And maybe I can ask Lisa to weigh in on that as well.
So from us being a case goods manufacturer predominantly, the key impact here isn't on raw chipboard or particle board. There hasn't been a major disruption to that key material. However, your componentry in terms of your furniture, of your case goods manufacturers, we've got a key supplier out in Durban. Their warehouse was entirely decimated, and it puts pressure. You can't move forward without your componentry. So that's been a big challenge. Fortunately, some of the guys have mitigated risk by having warehouses around the country, and they've, I think, stockpiled. I think COVID came in at a good time. So what COVID did is it allowed people to stock up and prepare a bit more. I wouldn't say like prepare for this type of event, but they had stockpiles. And that stockpiles are now going to be put under pressure. That's number one. There are obviously other supply chain effects that have come from COVID itself that are challenging. I'm just talking over the broader manufacturing. If we look at outside of the furniture industry, Durban would be very familiar with a factory called Toyota, and their local CEO had put out a note to say that, I mean, they suspended operations due to the ports not being functional, due to staff not being able to attend to work. So I think holistically, it's put a lot of pressure. For us locally, as a manufacturer, yes, you have to shut your factory down. I'm surprised to see a lot of guys have been able to be up and running as quickly as they have. So yeah, it's really a positive note to know that guys haven't felt the true crunch of things. I think once the dust has settled, people will from the demand side, you're going to see a lot of pressure. Just with the job numbers, people not working, the spend not being there anymore. For us as a business, we operate in a very low income areas, low income groupings. It's going to have a huge impact on spend in this industry. So that filters down to manufacturing. Your volumes are going to be lower. You're going to have more challenges from imports coming in. Importers are going to have, an added advantage because you cannot. I mean, in South Africa, in case goods or in furniture manufacturing, certain components can manufacture competitively. If you take the bedding and the lounge industries, because of the goods being of a voluminous nature and imports being very expensive to move around. In case goods, where you can get flat pack paneling done, you'll be competing against Chinese, Brazilian, Turkish markets, Malaysian markets. It's highly challenging as it is, and going forward, it's going to be even more challenging when you can't produce at 100% or even 200% to get your overhead recovery rates down. So yeah, I think that's something that we need to consider carefully.
Yeah, thanks, Mohammed. Lisa, you mentioned earlier that one of your raw material supplies was impacted. I mean, what do you think this could mean for the sector?
Yeah, it was one of the fabric suppliers who obviously imports a lot of fabric, and they store it at their warehouse, and we pull from off, and they keep the stock for us. Before we send out our forecast, they have 6 months up to forecast our fabric in their warehousing it there. They got completely looted, so obviously devastating for them, and they will only be able to get, also with the delays due to COVID and on the shipping side, and with the ports being affected, it does have a big ripple effect. So we had to alternatively source for additional supply, which is quite sort of like devastating, because the factory will have to now shift to a supplier that does have stock. And at the end of the day, right now, I think where there is availability of raw material, that's where the spend is going to happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, it's unfortunate, but it makes a lot of sense in terms of needing to continue with retail where you can. I mean, maybe on the retail route, Lucy, you can weigh in on, I mean, we've spoken a little bit about raw material supply. I don't know if you've got any comments there, but I'd also be interested in hearing what impact this could have had on supply chain and logistics routes?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of logistics, I think the change coming our way is definitely going to be, I guess it's the cost of kind of security. I guess it's the cost of risk management that we're going to have to manage. And I mean, you guys know we've got a big warehouse in Hammersdale there, and I certainly could not sleep any night, and actually still not sleeping at night, thinking about our distribution center. And because, I mean, I don't know if there's anybody here attached to value or macro or retailability, and watching their warehouses go down was just nothing short of absolutely devastating. And the thought of that happening to us was something it was impossible to think about. So it was a real fear, and obviously that's something we're looking at as a business. That's, you know, it's obviously we would be doing that, so I'm definitely not sharing any strategy here. It's risk we have to manage. So whatever that looks like is probably going to add cost into our logistic chain, because we are going to have to build in some redundancy, because, you know, it's fine and well that we can find a space up in a Joburg or wherever as a just in case space that could take all the volume that we would need if and when we ever ended up in a situation like this again. But we wouldn't be using it in general on a regular basis. So you're going to be building redundancy into your costs there. So I would say all in all, in terms of logistics, we are going to be looking at a little bit of additional costs and just managing risk. And yeah, I mean, you also spoke to me, would we be looking at going more direct to store? Would we be looking at going more direct to customer? Obviously, those are things that we dabble in at the moment, not to a massive extent. But I can't really see us having huge change in our delivery methods. Obviously, in terms of our allocations, our find picks, and you know, making the latest possible calls, is we're very reliant on a really highly functioning and technologically advanced distribution centers. So I can't see us changing too much. I can see our e-com channel becoming more and more important, but again, you know, there's risk there where that stock sits, and that's going to be the big thing in logistics now, is going to be managing that risks.
Sure. Thanks, Lucy. All really valid points, and you've raised, you know, your risk is where your stock sits. So definitely something to consider, regardless of the mechanisms for managing logistics. I mean, Lisa, being you know, a company that your distribution center was burnt down in Durban. I mean, what does that mean for you guys?
Yes, I mean, I think the most important thing for us is that none of our staff got injured. And the second most important thing was to reach out to all of the customers who was affected with the orders that got destroyed. And I must say, we had quite a positive response from our customers, we call them guests, with how proactive we were to reaching out, giving them alternative options. Yeah, so it is, if your stock, it's like Lucy said, like the risk is if your stock isn't all in one place and there is something that happens, you have to spread the risk. We are fortunate that our DC hub in Durban it's one of our smaller distribution centers. A majority of our stock is up in Joburg and Cape Town, but it's definitely had a massive impact on the amount of guests or the customers whose orders got affected. And they're already sitting in a state with unsurety and paid for a purchase. And so, yeah, it's been, but I think we definitely made sure that we communicated with our guests and keeping them informed, which was, I think, very, very well received from our customers.
Thanks, Caesar. And I mean, where to from here? Do we rebuild a distribution center, or do we relook at how we do logistics?
Yeah, I mean, we're quite fortunate because we're part of a big group. So we have a short-term solution now where we can use one of our company's facilities in the short term, but we're figuring it out. We had to make use of alternative logistic companies to help and assist us with transporting our goods down from Midrand. There has been delays, but yeah, I think we're all figuring it out. I don't know. I don't think we don't know what the right answers are right now, but I definitely think spreading your risk is going to be crucial for the future.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I mean, you raised a valid point that as a larger group of companies, you've got that support in this type of situation. Mohammed, coming from the perspective where you're more in touch with the smaller companies, I mean, what do you think this means for logistics in that space?
I think if you look at it from a small business perspective, I think my colleagues here are familiar with the large groups. You've got 100 stores in our case. We lost 17, quite a large 17% of our base. What does it mean to that small manufacturer?
Sorry, Mohammed, I seem to have lost your audio.
Sorry about that.
There you go. Yeah, you're back.
What I was saying is, what impact does that 17% have on the smaller manufacturer? Let's look at it from that perspective firstly. He cannot afford to be 17% lower on his order volumes to our business. That's the real reality. What does he do? He can't simply reduce his space or the number of heads that he has in his business because he's already running lean. It takes his cost base up. Let's look at it from the knock-on effect. Part and parcel of our business is distributing goods to smaller retailers as well and supporting them. And they don't have the luxury of 100 stores to mitigate risk. You're talking of a business owner with 1 or 2 or 3 stores. I was watching, on the news, a guy has 3 stores in one mall. And the entire mall is decimated. So he spread his risk among 3 and he thought, I'm fine. And the entire mall's gone. And what now for him? So we can take it into from a manufacturer's point of view, what happens to his business? He's got 1 location. To the smaller business owner who doesn't have the luxury of us sitting on the panel with many stores, how do we revive, rebuild? Those guys, I mean, they were the security guards of their businesses in the last couple of days. And it's sad, to see that, because I don't know how many of those businesses have reserves to restart and move forward and have these, I call it discussions of luxury rather than discussions of necessity. Because where does he go? We know funding is a problem. You go to your banks, you go to your IDCs. The president's talked about the Solidarity Fund. Nobody, personally, I haven't come across any one company that has benefited from that fund. So the access to those, facilities, even if they are there and they are working efficiently, it's a very difficult process for those guys to get up and running. For bigger companies, we can make the plans. We've got those luxuries at hand. We've got a business left. 1 warehouse out of 10 has been affected. It's a luxury. For a small guy, it's not a luxury anymore. It's a matter of survival. And I don't think you're going to see a lot of them coming back into the space. That's the real reality of it.
Yeah, and that's a very sad reality. Thanks for shedding light on that, Mohammed. But as mentioned, we're unsure of what's going on in across the diverse range of companies in the furniture sector. So a poll is going to pop up, and we're just going to find out from you, what type of supply chain disruptions are you anticipating or are you experiencing, and where is the critical break? There are 4 options there, and if I could just ask the participants in today's session to respond. Thanks, Vivian. Really appreciating your use of the chat box. Please, if anybody else has some discussion points for the chat, you're welcome to do so to engage with the conversation at hand. And again, a reminder, if you've got any questions for the panel, please use the Q&A. And thanks everybody for responding to the poll. I'm just going to share the results. Sort of a neck and neck race. So barely anybody has had no disruptions. So we're seeing quite a bit of damage to key suppliers, but above all, an unavailability of raw materials. And I think as part of the discussion, a lot of that is being exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis, and the fact that a lot of our materials actually end up being imported as well, specifically in the componentry space and the fabric space as well. Logistics also seem to be quite a big challenge. So thank you everyone for responding there. So moving on, I mean, we've spoken about operations, supply chains, but a key component of this is people, you know, not just directly in terms of our employees or business owners, but also down the line in terms of supply chains. So Mohammed, I mean, do you foresee any productivity challenges for the workforce following this crisis?
Definitely. In terms of our own people, it's a sad reality that you have to, you know, lay off people without any clarity at this stage. You don't know when malls are going to be rebuilt, and putting people on short time for this period of time. It's a hard ask to ask your people, number one, and then secondly, number two is you still ask them to be like security guards to protect their own businesses, because their workplaces are literally their own businesses. I think where we sit, I call it, we live in ivory towers, because we, you know, at head office level or, you know, support functions, we're not on the ground necessarily and being affected. And when you speak to the guy on the ground that's been personally affected, it's very hard. Then from a customer point of view, I think I'm talking of a very Johannesburg-based opinion on where we were affected. If you look at the townships, previously those township malls never existed for longer than 10 to 15 years ago. And those malls went into those townships for a particular reason. Make, you know, goods and services more accessible to the customer. And yes, but as business, you know, we thrived on it. But from a customer point of view now, those conveniences are no longer there. And I think it's going to be taxing on the consumer in that way. For the middle to higher income earners, I think that the crunch will come much later if they haven't seen it as yet. Goods and services will just become, I think my colleagues have alluded to, you know, how do we adjust costs? You know, there's a cost of redundancy. There's a cost of added security. Somebody at the end of the day has to pay for it. And ultimately, it's a consumer that's going to be paying for something that really doesn't add value to his life. You're going to see a huge impact on that. Not in a very, very short term, but definitely in the medium and longer term. It could lead to, you know, people demanding higher salaries, because there's a cost of living becomes much higher, and we can't pay. You know, as consumers and business, the cost of operating can't be exorbitant anymore. As you know, as we government can play its role, is facilitating, creating the frameworks and the environment of a safe business environment. You know, business-friendly environment where, you know, challenging businesses to grow, challenging businesses to invest, employ more people, and in turn create the economy that everybody wants to see South Africa ending up with. And I think, for me, I think we're going to be, as a country, I see we're going to be put back a number of years, especially after COVID and the impacts of COVID. It's going to be watch this space. I mean, I'd love to see the country rise and progress, but the reality is I can't see it happening very, very soon.
Yeah, thanks, Mohammed. You raised some very valid points there in terms of, you know, we've got to account for those costs somehow, and ultimately, you know, our workforce are the people with disposable income. So they dictate demand for our products as well. And we've got to figure out how to absorb those costs in a way that doesn't, you know, affect people. I mean, on that, we have a quick poll again in terms of the firms on this call. We just want to find out, you know, how have your employees been affected so far by the unrest? We're talking specifically around physical harm, travel, trauma, or maybe they're all okay as well. Okay, thanks everyone for responding. So we're seeing that majority of firms, thank goodness, a lot of your employees are unharmed, however, unable to travel to work. So that's definitely going to have an impact on productivity in the shorter term. And it sounds like many have experienced some form of psychological trauma, which is absolutely devastating and will definitely have some form of impact on the workforce. I'd be very curious if in the chat anybody could elaborate a little bit more on the psychological trauma and whether and how it's been impacting your firm at the moment. It would be very interesting to hear. Great. So we're going to chat now about demand, which I think is a very hot topic, and I'm sure most of you on the call are wanting to find out about. And this is actually a good lead-in from what Mohammed was discussing around the cost side. So first, maybe to Lucy and possibly Lisa as well. I mean, we've spoken quite extensively about the fact that a lot of retail stores have been affected. But what do we see in the longer run in terms of rebuilding and getting back to operation? Do we anticipate those stores coming back online?
Shall I start?
Sure.
So, I mean, it was being publicized that across the Mr. Price Group, and that's all of our divisions, including Power, that we had 109 stores looted across divisions, about 7% of our total stores. On the home side, which obviously relates to this forum in terms of furniture, we were really incredibly lucky when I look at what some of the other businesses had to face. And we've had 4 stores, and none of which were our flagship stores. And so there's definitely appetite to restock, rebuild. None of them were burnt. So it's not a point of destruction beyond repair, thankfully. And yeah, so there's definitely an appetite to rebuild those stores and restock them. We might look at one space in particular. We were looking to downsize anyway, but only because it just wasn't particularly profitable. We will still have a store in that center. So in general, relatively unaffected from our side, and yeah, feeling very, very lucky in terms of that. And then just relating back to demand, we've obviously, I mean, the same as I'm sure everybody on this call have been having divisional, every single morning, having a divisional meeting followed by a group meeting. Obviously, we're looking at forecasts, the same as I'm sure, well, I mean, we do every month, we do every week, but it's particularly pertinent now. And obviously, we are looking at our forecasts, but the general consensus from the home side of the business is that our KPIs remain. And obviously, as you guys know, we're a bunch of corporate beasts. We get driven by our KPIs. They drive our activities and our actions. And the general area that we were targeting for growth remains the same. And the general targeted sort of market sectors that we've been driving towards remain the same. And I'm not completely naive. I know that operationally and tactically, we are going to be seriously going to have to tuck and roll and catch more curveballs that just seem to keep coming. And, you know, this is all with the assumption that this is finished now and that there's not going to be further disruption, touch wood. But in terms of demand from our local, you know, part of our strategy has always been local procurement. And it's part of our strategy for really solid reasons. It's part of our strategy because it provides us with agility. It's part of our strategy because there's certain areas where it makes sense cost-wise. And, you know, I mean, we all know what a container costs from China these days, and it would make your hair stand on end. our customer actually loves it. She loves it when we talk to South African made product. And also we've made commitments to the States by the CTFL master plan anyway, in terms of this. So we're not looking to divest from South Africa on what's happened now. And I think what's actually happened now is, in our lifetime, we've literally just witnessed what unemployment does. And whilst I know there were all goings on and things happening, which I don't pretend to really be able to unpack or know anything about, and that perhaps spilled out onto the streets, I think what we do know is that, you know, a 32% unemployment, a huge wealth gap, and a massive youth population meant that we were always heading towards some form of, I don't know if it was unrest, but definitely people demanding change in some way or another was going to happen inevitably. So for us to pull out of South Africa now in terms of our manufacturing and our desire to grow South African manufacture would be not irresponsible just in terms of like our nation and the commitments we've made to government, but also we would be writing our own epitaph in a way, because this will happen again if we don't get unemployment under control. So we're very dedicated to our local procurement program. And whilst I understand that I might be coming from a bit of a naive point of view in terms of what it's going to take to get those businesses up and running again, the desire definitely from the retail perspective is that we want to keep driving and drive hard.
Thanks, Lucy. Maybe Lisa, if you want to then just weigh in on that as well.
Yes. Yeah, I think just from our stores that was affected, TFG as a group were, I think in total 190 stores that got looted. Fortunately for at home, we only had to temporarily close 10 stores. All of them are, except for one in Watercress, we unfortunately the whole mall is closed. So we've only had one store that wasn't able to reopen again. But we definitely will continue to open stores. Also, we are very committed to grow local production side. We are proactively looking for new suppliers. I think by diversifying your supply chain is just the responsible thing to do, and also investing in the country. And I think, you know, that excitement that it does create just within our team, to our guests, to our manufacturers, to see their product in our stores, the pride that it creates for the people manufacturing the product. I do think there is so much potential in South Africa, and we're only like tipping into it. So if I look at the amount of small manufacturers that is exporting to mainstream retailers in the US and in Europe, which we haven't even started on tapping into. So I think there's so much opportunity still that we as retailers can sort of more focus on the local design capabilities, and sort of also taking the designs and streaming it to the manufacturing side.
Very encouraging to hear that retail's talking about, you know, reinvesting in the local economy. It's almost as if it's a non-discussion point. It's going to happen. And that's really encouraging. And you've mentioned some very valid points in terms of, you know, they're the people that are actually buying a product. They're not just making it, they're buying it as well. So again, there's going to be a quick poll popping up, and we just want to find out from businesses, obviously, depending on who your customer is, what do you anticipate the impact of this crisis being on your market demand? Maybe you've got a large retailer as your customer, and you know, you're really excited about partnering with them on their growth strategy. Maybe you've got smaller retailers who've decided not to reinvest in opening their product, or potentially your customer isn't even a retailer, they are a food chain or hospitality or other. So it would be really great to hear from you where you foresee your demand going over the next year. But while those poll results are coming in, maybe we can just chat quickly about recovery. You know, maybe Bernadette, I can start with you. Is, you know, we've seen that firms have suffered, and we know that there's been a lot of work in the local sector in terms of trying to support growth in the industry. What does this potentially mean for recovery plans going forward, particularly those being driven by SAFI?
Thanks, Paige. So I think based on the discussions and information we had today, I think it's quite positive to see, because all of this is driven by demand. And I think it's very positive to see, even if it's only two discussion today, but I think it's very positive to see that if we can start off on that note, that we need to grow the sector. We need to create jobs. So, and I think if we start with that, and I'm quite happy to hear that even if it's just two retailers, that there is still some positivity out of this for the furniture industry.
Thanks, Bernadette. Yeah, it's really positive, and I think it highlights, especially with motivation from today's discussion, the importance of driving local procurement even further, and supporting the the engagements between retail and manufacturers, and developing that local capability is just so important. My colleague Tam has just asked, in the poll, is your business able to recover? Are those on today's call? How are you feeling about recovery? So some of the feedback we're getting, there seems to be minimal impact. That's really fantastic to hear. Minimal to no impact. We're not seeing any significant impact on those that are so far that are responding. But while that's happening, maybe providing the opportunity for any Q&As to come through for the panel. I haven't received any so far, so it'd be great that if you do have any questions, we can use the last 5 minutes to engage with the panel around those. Alternatively, if we don't receive anything, I will ask the panel to, I'll open up the floor for the panel to provide any closing remarks around this topic. Great, there's a Q&A question. Is it a concern from anyone about the potential loss of scarce and critical technical and capable skills due to immigration? Okay, so basically a skills drain in the sector due to the recent events.
Just speaking from our side, I think, we employ a lot of fairly young people at Mr. Price in our group in general. I mean, you should have seen when we opened up, we've been doing our own vaccine program, and when we opened up for 40 and over, it was like me and 50 other people. It was actually remarkable how few people there were over 40 in our group. So I think there are a lot of young people who aren't necessarily tied, in terms of, kids and schools and all those kind of things that keep you here, that it would be pretty easy at this stage to for them to emigrate. And in fact, within the last 2 days, we've already had 2 people from I'm talking about our head office space say that they are actively looking to emigrate, and they were just giving us 6 months notice that that's going to happen. So I think it is real.
Thanks, Lucy. We've got a question from Philippa Hume asking, are there any areas where we see the panel feels that suppliers can assist in the rebuild? Maybe Mohammed, I can pose that question to you.
I think within the smaller business manufacturing space, I think suppliers can come to assistance. I'm going to just, we as a big retailer and a manufacturer, I have 2 hats that I look at the business through. And from a retailer's point of view, we've got many of these smaller manufacturers that we support. And the biggest problem they have is cash flow. And I think through COVID, a lot of discussions have happened with big business. And it's like, for certain smaller businesses on the ground, if I cannot pay my smaller business within 7 to 14 days of delivering goods, those guys would never survive. So what their challenge is getting credit lines, getting effective credit lines from suppliers, So they can offer, their bigger customers, expand their businesses, offer the credit that the bigger businesses demand. I remember we sat in a session with Safi a couple of years ago. I think it was about 2 years ago, back in the good old days of no social distancing. And the question came, a guy, smaller manufacturers posed the question, I'm supplying goods into a larger group. My product has been approved, but I cannot meet this one term of offering them 60 days payment. And no one really had answers to that. For me, it was something foreign because that's how our business, it was so ingrained in our business. Over 50% of the local guys that I operate with are paid on that basis. And without them, we won't have a supply chain left. So to answer your question, I think it's going to become more demanding on suppliers to assist their, smaller manufacturers. The larger manufacturers, definitely they have access to, credit facilities. They're nice to have corporate luxuries. But I think practically from a small business perspective, a lot of them don't have track records, or, they're marginal in their profitability, but they're good operators. I mean, the guys are good furniture makers, they're good artisans, and they don't have this ability to operate and grow their businesses. So yeah, that's what you can do practically.
Great, that's a fantastic answer. Thanks, Mohammed. And then a final question for want of saving time. Anton asked Lucy and Lisa, how is big retail engaging directly with government around a way forward?
Listen, I'm not personally engaging with government myself, but there's a direct line. And I would imagine Lisa's CEO is also in the same forum, where I know that there's about 20 CEOs who have formed a caucus or a forum and are able to actually get direct to the president's office communication happening at the moment, which is really, really encouraging. So as I was speaking to some of my suppliers who I chatted to yesterday and the day before, and really, really encouraging, like all of these issues, these major things that you're seeing because the question is, where do we need to help? Government's asking, what do we need to do? Where do we need to help? So to get that information up to the right ears and to be formed in the right forum is absolutely vital. So if, Anton, you've got my email, but anybody out there, so welcome to send me anything that you think is really, really vital that we can, and I'm sure Lisa's the same, that we can get up to the right ears so that the questions get posed and the information of what's really required on the ground is out there. And I think that's kind of what we're hoping that forum is going to bring.
Great, thanks, Lucy. Lisa, maybe because the question was also posed to yourself, if you've got anything else to add.
No, I think Lucy's covered it all. I don't have so much insight, but I'm sure our CEO and Anthony are communicating directly. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Thanks. And on that note, we've just gone 1 minute past 2, so I'm going to have to close the session. But if anybody else has any other questions, you're more than welcome to email them to us at efc@bmanalyst.com, and we'll engage further with the panelists around any questions you may have. Otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and a special thank you again to our panel. It's been a fantastic discussion. Really enjoyed it. You've been amazing. And also, again, a big thanks to our funder, eThekwini. And we'll chat with everyone soon. Thanks very much, everybody.